Hello, I'm Steph, aka Literati Medium. Hey guys, it's editing Steph here. I'm just tuning in because you may have noticed it's been quite a few weeks since I last posted. I hit a bit of a mental health low, and I had to really take some time to think about how I want to move forward with my content so that I don't get burned out. I think I want to have my focus be primarily my YouTube channel, and I'm still gonna post occasionally to Twitter, and I want to focus also on my blog, but I'm kind of stepping away a little bit from Instagram and TikTok. I'm going to use Instagram primarily as a way that you can reach out to me if you want to, and also for things like polls or giveaways or something like that. And then TikTok, I'm just gonna post when I want to post. Because TikTok is fun, but at the end of the day, I also find it a little stressful because you have to post so often to even be relevant. So I've just decided to take a step back, and that if I do post something on TikTok, it's because I actually want to post it. I'm also thinking about adding some reactions to my channel content, particularly focusing on, of course, adaptations. So if you have any adaptations you'd like to recommend for me to watch and react to, leave me a comment. Those won't be on a set schedule, it will just be as I watch things. I think that it'll be a lot of fun. You'll also notice that this is not my wrap-up and TBR like it normally would be. This was the video that I had most completed, so I decided to go ahead and post it rather than skip another upload. I'm hoping to get my wrap-up and TBR for November up by like Wednesday this week, so stay tuned for that. Today, it's time for another Book vs. Adaptation. Today's Book vs. Adaptation is going to be The Last Duel by Eric Jager. So the format for this Book vs. Adaptation is going to be a little different from normal. I'm going to try and keep this as spoiler-free as possible because the main purpose of this video is to decide whether or not I liked the book or the movie better. Since I am not a fan of nonfiction, that was just naturally going to work against this book, and I wanted to give the book a fair shot. That being said, go watch this movie and go read this book. The order you do it in doesn't really matter. I will, however, still talk about plot, characters, and relationships. In a sense, this is going to be a little bit more of a strict review. So for the plot, which I really should call plot, setting, and other things, I can tell in the movie that a lot of care was taken to represent this era very faithfully. I actually noticed that when I was watching the film. I was like, wow, they really took care to make this feel real. And it was echoed when I read the first paragraph of the book. The book has a lot of fun historical facts, like the mythological background on Jean de Courroges' name, which I thought was a lot of fun, but I understand why they didn't put it in the movie. It wasn't relevant to what was going on. One of the things you may notice about the movie is that it takes place in France, but no one's really speaking in a French accent unless the actor actually has a French accent. And I can see how that might bother some people. It actually didn't bother me. It reminded me when I auditioned for a play that took place in 12th century, and we asked the director, are we going to have to do a British accent? His response was no, because everybody at that time would have been speaking French anyway. So it doesn't really matter what accent we're speaking English in, because they would have been speaking French. And I feel like that's the same approach they decided to use for this movie, and it didn't bother me. One of the historical changes the movie made that actually did kind of bother me was that they changed the color of Legree's liveries. He's supposed to be gray with a red stripe, and instead they made him like a bluey gray with like silver emblems. I don't remember exactly what the symbol was. Maybe if I can get an image, I'll put it here. So that bothered me a little bit because if you're basing this on a true story, facts like their coat of arms and their liveries should be accurate. That being said, from a storytelling standpoint, and from like, not necessarily storytelling standpoint, but from a visual standpoint, I understand why they made this change, because you don't necessarily want to have two people in similar colors. At the same time, it kind of bothered me because it wasn't right. The movie also takes some liberties with certain ceremonies, such as the marriage ceremony between Marguerite and Jean de Courrèges. I understand why they did it, because they were putting these ceremonies into a more modern context so that there was more clarity on what was going on. But at the same time, the history nerd in me was kind of like, well, I kind of wish that you had done it the way that it's described in the book so that it felt more accurate and more true to the time. Now, to be fair, I didn't notice that when I was watching the movie. I only felt that way after I read the book and read the differences between the ceremonies. There is a lot of emphasis placed in the movie, especially in Marguerite's point of view, that focuses on the crime of all crimes that women could commit back then, not bearing an heir. That was something that I was like, Okay, here's where I need to put a little bit of a trigger warning. From this point on, we're going to be talking more about the trial, which does discuss rape. So if that is triggering for you, I would suggest turning this video off and going to check out maybe one of my other book versus adaptations. Both the movie and the book ask the question about whether the rape actually occurred, but in very different ways. In the book, there are two questions about her rape. One, whether the act even occurred, and two, whether it was perpetrated by Legree. I found the book to be infuriating, not because Eric Jager doesn't say that it didn't occur, quite the contrary, but because of how historical records invalidate her story. Some take her side, but most say that she was either mistaken on the identity of her attacker or that she was forced to lie by her husband to get revenge on Legree, or that she was lying to cover up an affair. These views, passed down through history, are what allows rape culture to persist today. As a woman, it was really frustrating to see how little has changed in rape trials when it comes to victim blaming, and that hasn't changed in 600 years. All I have to say about this is, if you knew that bearing false witness would mean that you would be burned alive at the stake, would you report the crime? I wouldn't. In the movie, it's not a question about whether the act took place, but whether the act was rape. I did like that the movie made it very clear that by modern standards of consent, a rape definitely occurred. They made it so clear that when an interviewer asked Ridley Scott a question about how his friends asked him whose story was the correct story after leaving the movie, Ridley Scott shut the interviewer down and just said, "How stupid can they be? Sorry. I mean, are you joking?" This focus on consent makes it more relevant to what we see in cases today. Let's move on to characters. First, let's start with Count Pierre. I will say Ben Affleck is kind of hilarious and despicable in this role. I can tell he had a lot of fun with it. The only complaint I had about his portrayal was, what was up with that hair? Next, let's move on to Jacques Legree. The movie paints Jacques Legree as a heroic womanizer. I had no idea until I read the book that he was married with a family, and that in some ways makes it even worse. Not that it wasn't bad already. It's really bad, but that made it worse to me somehow when I read the book. Jean de Courrèges is kind of a fascinating character. His depiction varies drastically depending on who's telling the story. I did find that the other perspectives in the movie were actually closer to how Jean de Courrèges is described in the book through historical records. And starting with his perspective, that's going to paint himself in the best light possible in the movie, really gives it this almost unreliable narrator feel that I thought was fascinating and kind of a brilliant move. Marguerite in the book really isn't in it much, and that has a lot to do with, at the time, women were seen as property of their husbands, so they weren't necessarily considered important for historical record. The only reason her name is mentioned so much in historical records is because it is a rape case. This character is amazing in the movie. Jodie Comer is one of my favorite actresses working today, and she does not disappoint in this role. Next, let's move on to relationships. So I'm going to start off with the most obvious relationship, which is Jean and Marguerite. I found it really interesting how their relationship is portrayed differently between his perspective and her perspective in the movie. I found it to be very true to what they would have seen their relationship as from each other's perspective. Next, let's talk about Jacques and Marguerite. I hesitate to call this a relationship. I'm going to call it more of an interaction. What was interesting is that the first interaction between these two people is actually at the behest of her husband. Historical record says that she instigates things first. In this one instance, it was also obviously at the order of her husband. The way Jacques is depicted in the movie is he's very charming. He's actually, I found him by the end in some ways to be a more likable character than Jean de Courrèges, and that was actually quite different from how he's portrayed in the book. In the book, it is mentioned that he is very popular with women, but when it comes down to the act itself, it's brutal. There's no question that that's what he's doing based on the story, whereas it's much more ambiguous in the movie. All right, let's move on to Jean and Jacques. That's fun to say. Jean and Jacques. So this movie takes some of the grievances that Courrèges faces throughout history and puts even more of the burden on Legree, more of the fault on Legree. So the movie makes it build more and more and more that Courrèges just hates Legree because Legree is taking everything from him. I do really like how the movie shows that before all of this happened, they were friends, and that somehow makes the betrayal of everything that much worse. I also found it really interesting that in the movie, and this isn't specifically mentioned in the book, it kind of is just based on their background. Eric Jager makes some assumptions on Jean's education level that I don't think we can necessarily prove, but there is historical fact to show that Jacques was quite educated. And I think playing that off of each other, the uneducated knight versus the educated knight, was interesting. The last relationship I want to talk about is about Marguerite and Nicole. Nicole is Jean de Courrèges' mother. This relationship in the movie is fascinating and brutal, and something that I've noticed in stories that deal with rape culture and toxic masculinity is this theme of women also hating on women. I mean, Nicole flat out blames Marguerite for infidelity. In the movie, she also blames Marguerite for kind of causing a scene. They made an interesting twist in the movie that I'm not going to go into too much because, again, I'm trying to avoid a lot of spoilers. There's a lot of victim blaming going on and a lot of why are you making this such a big deal? This idea of not speaking out because oftentimes what you face from speaking out is worse than the act itself. That ties it into a more modern view because while women aren't necessarily being burned at the stake today for coming forward, there is still a lot of victim blaming that goes on. And it is because of the victim blaming that victims don't speak out. So there you have it. That's my book versus adaptation review. I highly recommend both. I'm not a fan of nonfiction, and I still read this book in 4 days. I think Eric Jager wrote it in such a way that it's very digestible for nonfiction. The movie is just all around brilliantly written, performed, directed. I would not be surprised if I saw it on an Oscar list, to be honest with you. That's just my personal opinion. If you go see it or read the book, tell me what you think down in the comments below. Also, in the spirit of this video, I have listed a link down in the description below that's a document full of resources for victims of sexual assault. If you or someone you know has been a victim, know that there are resources out there for you. I'm sorry this video was a bit of a downer, but I definitely don't want to shy away from more serious topics on this channel. If you like talking about some more serious issues, let me know. Of course, if you want to talk about what I've said in this video or anything related to this video, feel free to reach out to me in the comments. Have a good night, and let's see what stories tomorrow brings.